Good morning, everybody.
Yeah.
Today, in today's session, we are going to discuss about uh, various streams of Bhakti movement in northern India. It's a continuation to what we have been doing in last session, where we were uh, introducing ourselves, educating ourselves about the origin and the spread of Bhakti movement in South India in different places in different timelines and its impact on the social cultural milieu of those regions. Today, Ravi is going to take us through the history and origin and its spread uh, of Bhakti movement in northern India and different streams in that Bhakti movement and how it impacted various dimensions of life, especially in northern Indian society. So, Ravi, I request you please to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Bhargav, and thank you everybody for coming. And let me start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see the screen? Yeah. Okay. Yes, as Bhargav says, now we have moved from south to north. As the legend goes, Bhakti also moved from south to north. But I will today take a little bit different take on Bhakti than the usual self-description of Bhakti in the in Bhagavad in the preface to Bhagavad Mahatmya, written sometime in 17th or 18th century. Bhakti described herself as being born in the Tamil land and then coming to North India through the effort of Ramanand. That's the legendary story, but actual situation was different, and that is what I will try to. It's a very long story, very complex story, but I will try to summarize today. So we will deal with prehistory, history, and the aftermath of Bhakti movement in North India. By Bhakti movement in North India, I would largely mean its core period, which is between 15th and 18th century, roughly. But we will spend quite a bit of time, a good portion of today's discussion on the prehistory, which is, we will see why this timeline, but which is mainly between 600 and 1400. ये बहुत सारे लोगों के लिए जो जगह जगह CE लिखा हुआ है, इसका मतलब है कॉमन एरा, जो AD भी लिखते हैं, लैटिन वाला AD है, ये ईसवी सदी समझ लीजिए, ईसवी सदी है. But we will spend equal amount of time on its prehistory, without which the making and the impact of Bhakti movement cannot be understood. So in the prehistory, we will see briefly the immediate aftermath of empire. By empire, I mean Gupta Empire. Before Bhakti movement, India on the subcontinental scale had seen two great empires. One, the Maurya Empire in about 300 BC, and 600 years later, the Gupta Empire, after 300 AD. We will not go that far into the prehistory, even though Bhakti movement has that prehistory too. But we will see the immediate aftermath of the empire. Then we will move to the Tantric era, and this will be the most important part. Tantric era is between 700 and 1200 CE. And we will briefly deal with various sects, and Tantrics came from all religious denominations, Shaiva, Shakta, Nath Yogis, Vajrayani Buddhists, some Jains, even some Vaishnavas, they did not contribute that much to the tantric stream, but still. Then we will move to the period of Shankar's Vedanta and aftermath, which ran parallel to within the tantric era, but ran parallel to it. Then we will later come to Sufis, which who arrived after Islam arrived in India, and also we will mention the arrival of vernacular movement. This, rather than Bhakti moving from Tamil land through Karnataka and Maharashtra and Gujarat to north, I think what actually moved was the vernacular movement. Vernacular movement means Sanskrit and the classical Sanskrit being replaced, as a literary form, literary language by local languages in which Bhakti movement played a very important role. So, and then we will move on to, we will also spend equal time on the aftermath, which is colonial period, national movement, and today's India as well. Our main objective is to understand the role of Bhakti movement along with its precedents and antecedents in weaving the mind of Indian society at the grassroots level. And this we are doing in order to understand the role of popular cultural mind in contemporary politics. You know that our whole discussion in last year or couple of years has been about role of trying to understand communalism, communal politics today, Hindutva fascists, and so on. And we started, just to remind you, with partition, because we thought that that was a major outburst, major upheaval of communalism. That is an important fault line, a menacing fault line in our social soil. So we started with partition, and then we moved on to history, from ancient times till today. And then in the history of the medieval period, we started discussing Bhakti movement, which has played the most important, most decisive role in shaping the Indian cultural mind. So this is why we are discussing what we are discussing today, and we discussed the same thing for South India in past 2 meetings. Now, all that I am proposing cannot be done in one session. Today we will try to be done with prehistory and history, but let us see how it goes. So briefly, हिंदी में हम लोग फोकस तो करेंगे भक्ति मूवमेंट पर, जो 1400 से 1700 का पीरियड आइडेंटिफाई किया जा सकता है जिसके लिए, लेकिन हम उसके पहले के इतिहास पर, इमीडिएट पहले के इतिहास पर और बाद के इतिहास पर भी लगभग उतना ही समय लगाएंगे। पहले के इतिहास में गुप्ता एम्पायर के ठीक बाद का समय आता है, फिर लगभग 500 साल का तांत्रिक एरा, तांत्रिक युग का समय आता है 700 से 1200 का। उसी के समानांतर तांत्रिक युग के अंदर ही वेदांतियों का समय आता है। थोड़ा बाद में 1200 के आसपास से सूफियों का आगमन होता है। और इन सब के साथ साथ 14वीं शताब्दी तक आते आते जो लोक भाषा आंदोलन है, पुरानी शास्त्रीय भाषाओं का, वो चाहे संस्कृत हो चाहे प्राकृत हो, उनको उनकी जगह स्थानीय भाषाओं का उदय और उनमें साहित्य की रचना, जिसमें भक्ति आंदोलन ने महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका निभाई। हम लोग भक्ति आंदोलन पर जितना समय लगाएंगे उतना ही समय उसके पहले के इतिहास पर और उसके बाद के इतिहास पर भी लगाएंगे, क्योंकि हमारा उद्देश्य है भक्ति मूवमेंट ने जिस तरह से लोक मानस का निर्माण किया है ग्रास रूट लेवल पर, उसको समझना और उसका योगदान आज के पॉलिटिक्स में क्या हो रहा है, कैसे हो रहा है, उसको समझना। इन्हीं कारणों से हम लोगों ने ये सारी चर्चा इस स्टडी सर्कल में शुरू की है, हिंदुत्व और कम्युनल फासिज्म वगैरह को समझने के लिए, जिसके लिए हम लोगों ने भारत के विभाजन की चर्चा की थी, फिर इतिहास की चर्चा की थी, और अब भक्ति आंदोलन की चर्चा कर रहे हैं। यह सारा एक दिन में हो पाना तो संभव नहीं है, लेकिन आज हिस्ट्री और प्री हिस्ट्री खत्म करने की कोशिश करेंगे। What I am giving here a reminder of dateline, just a reminder. And this I am giving also because I will urge you, I will request you to, this whole exercise is more about making a mental picture of India in different eras and different ages and different times. The difficulty with dealing with the history of a very large subcontinent and very large swath of time is that, language or description is very limited. Language and description and analysis always follows one track, one trajectory, whereas as the historical reality was very vast and complex and spread out. So always one has to try to imagine what was India like, in those times, especially in the context of what we are focusing on. So after this date line also, I will show you some maps. I don't know if you are joining the meeting on your phones, then how much of the maps you can see or how much of the details of the slides you can see. But the maps I will run through for the point that I will later make about the key features, how the subcontinent underwent political as well as cultural changes. So हम ये जो तारीखें बता रहे हैं ये सिर्फ इसलिए बता रहे हैं ताकि आपको याद भी दिला दें, और ये आप कोशिश करें कि भारत का एक चित्र, एक सांस्कृतिक मानचित्र, ऐतिहासिक मानचित्र भी आप अपने दिमाग में बनाएं अलग अलग समय के लिए, क्योंकि जो आप चित्र बनाएंगे उन्हीं के संदर्भ में जो बातें की जा रही हैं, इस बार भक्ति आंदोलन की जा रही हैं, तो भक्ति आंदोलन को समझा जा सकता है. The date line is classical era. What we call is Gupta Empire, which is 320 to 550 Common Era. Just to give you an idea, Kalidas was, during that period, Kalidas, the famous Sanskrit poet, 4th and 5th century. Aryabhatta was a little later, and Harshvardhan, after the disintegration of Gupta Empire, Harshvardhan, other important ruler for North India, as far as history of North India is concerned, he ruled from 606 to 647. This I will include, up to Harshvardhan, I will include more or less in the classical era. I am not going into pre-Christian era, pre-Christ era of, period of Buddha and Mahavir, and later on Maurya Empire, and the era of Upanishads and so on. Then what I call Tantric age, not I call, I mean people have called, is 700 to 1200 CE. And just to remind you, Shankaracharya, for example, was from 788 to 820. Now, this lifetime of Shankaracharya is part legendary. No one knows actually his lifespan, but he was around, roughly around that time. Ramanuj, one is more certain of, he lived from 1077 to 1157. Other main feature of this period was the raids of Mahmud Ghazni. It started in year 1000, and he had some 17 or 18 raids, between 1000 and 1026, and Somnath was famously sacked by him, Somnath temple. And the date that more or less closes is this period, or you can draw a line, no period exactly closes, but you can draw a line, is the defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan by Muhammad Ghori in 1192. Then the third important phase is Delhi Sultanate, which is 1206 to 1526. And again, to remind you, because we are dealing with the religious and cultural history more, we are in that context, the famous names are Nizamuddin Auliya, the Sufi saint, who lived between 1238 and 1325. Amir Khusro, the genius, who played key role in emergence of Hindavi as a new language, and new forms of literary expressions. Kabir Das, Saint Kabir was between 1398 and 1518. Now that is a lifespan of 120 years. No one knows whether he lived that long or not, but roughly around that time. And Nanak's period is more life has more certain datelines. That is 469 to 1539. Again, I remind you that these things I am just giving you to remember and to help you imagine North India of those times. And then comes the period of Mughal Empire that I have taken only from Akbar to Aurangzeb. Before Akbar, there was unstable period, and after Aurangzeb, there was period of decline. And during this period, since we are talking Bhakti movement, the two most famous names are of Surdas, 1488 to 1480 to 1580, again, some uncertainty, and Tulsidas, 1511 to 1623, and we can take other names, like Mirabai and so on. I think these are simple enough. Should I translate everything, every slide in Hindi? I think it should be okay. I mean, just stop me and ask for Hindi whenever there is need and I am forgetting. Okay, so let me show you some maps, and there is a reason why I am showing these maps. Are these maps visible to you? This is the map of Gupta Empire. And you see, it covers a very large part of the subcontinent and all of North India, practically all of North India of those times, I mean, what later became British India, And the second map is connected, what I want to Guptas and Vakataks. I don't know how to pronounce it. I think they are in Hindi, they are called Vakatak, but Vakatakas,
Right.
So Guptas and Vakatakas together covered a very large part of all of North India and large part of the subcontinent. Just some other kingdoms were further south. This I am saying that India was more or less in Gupta era. In the classical era, there was a very large empire. These Guptas and Vakatakas were related. One of the daughters of one of the Gupta empires was married to Vakatakas, and Guptas and Vakatakas together, with the help of Vakatakas, Guptas conquered Gujarat area and included in their empire. So this is more or less very collaborative, very together, and together they covered most of South Asia. So it was a large empire, and you will see in a minute why I am pointing out. So the classical era can be identified with a very large empire and very stable political system. If you go to the next map, this is the North Indian dynasties, are shown mostly in North. The map shows mostly North India, even though you can see geographically part of Vindhyas and all that. But many kingdoms you see. So you see, after the classical era, after 700 or so, North India politically was very fragmented. And these major names, major kingdoms that you see in North India in this period between 700 and 1100, even this does not do justice to the fragmentation of North India. There were literally, several dozens of kingdoms spread across, and if you really are careful about, political sovereignties and areas of influence and so on. Maybe hundreds of kingdoms and principalities were there in North India. So this was a period of extreme fragmentation, political fragmentation in North India. And when you come to Delhi Sultanate, then again you see most of the subcontinent being covered by one large kingdom, by the Sultanate. This is Sultanate at its peak. This is Tughlaq dynasty around 1330. Okay, so this covers, you see, most of, just part of east and southeast, and a small piece at the very end of the peninsula, the Tamil, Malayalam areas. Most of the subcontinent is covered by Delhi Sultanate. And next, this thing does go through many changes. The Sultanate shrinks, fragments, and all that. And that is why Mughals were able to defeat the Sultanate and establish their empire. And you see, this is the Mughal Empire. So I don't know, in the top, you can see around Kabul a blue line. That was originally, that is what Babur started with. But by Akbar's time, the yellow area that you see, that was added by Akbar to what Babur had, and the orange area that you see, that was added by Aurangzeb. So the blue line plus the yellow area plus the orange area, which covers, most of the subcontinent, one of the largest empires India has seen. That was the situation in India by 1707. So this again was a very large empire. And then just after that, after the decline of Mughals, this map, for example, it shows India around 1760, just before the British begin their climb to their domination of India and eventual colonization of whole of India. This was the situation in 1760, and again you see it was extremely fragmented. The whole subcontinent was fragmented into many major and huge number of small kingdoms. Small kingdoms. One cannot show that. Just the major names are there, but the map shows extreme fragmentation. So if you summarize this thing, then you see that two major periods on a very large scale, on the subcontinental scale and on the millennial scale, very large geographic area and very large, scale of time. There were two major periods of decay and political vulnerability, political, social, cultural vulnerability. One was the period between 700 and 1100, just after Harshvardhan and just before Delhi Sultanate. This was the period, which was, a kind of real, I would say dark period. These words are very controversial. People get angry over these things, especially in today's post-colonial, post-modern, intellectual environment. But, just to describe to you the decline from the empire of the classical era, this was very fragmented and not a good period for North India. South probably was different because South in this period had many major, kingdoms. And the second period of decay and decline was after Aurangzeb and before, between 1700, after Aurangzeb and before, the British, before colonization of India, complete colonization of India. These two periods were periods of political fragmentation, and in different ways also period of cultural decay. So
रवि,
now
रवि मुझे लगता है इसके पहले जो, क्योंकि इसका पहले वाला ये वाला चैप्टर पोर्ट्रेट, ये जो स्लाइड है, इसको अगर थोड़ा
हाँ,
हिंदी में बता सकें अच्छा रहेगा थोड़ा,
हिंदी
क्योंकि
में,
आप
हाँ,
कंक्लूड
अच्छा,
कर रहे
ठीक
हैं।
है, ठीक है। या मैं ये मैप आप लोगों को इसलिए दिखा रहा हूं ताकि आप अपने दिमाग में डिफरेंट पीरियड्स का और पूरे सब कॉन्टिनेंट का चित्र बना सकें, स्पेशली उत्तरी भारत का चित्र बना सकें। मैप से हम लोगों की स्टोरी का सीधा संबंध नहीं है, लेकिन हमारी स्टोरी तभी समझ में आ सकती है और उसका अच्छा चित्र हम अपने दिमाग में तभी बना सकते हैं जब पूरे भारत का और स्पेशली उत्तरी भारत का राजनैतिक और सांस्कृतिक चित्र किसी न किसी रूप में आप अपने दिमाग में बना सके। हर दिमाग अपने हिसाब से चित्र बनाता है, लेकिन कुछ हद तक उसमें कोहेरेंस हम सभी के दिमागों में लगभग एक ही तरह का चित्र हो, ताकि हम एक ही संदर्भ में अपनी पूरी कथा को समझ सकें भक्ति आंदोलन की। उसके लिए मैं ये दिखा रहा हूं। तो ये पहला पीरियड जो है, पहला मैप जो है, ये गुप्ता एम्पायर का है, और दूसरा मैप भी गुप्ता एम्पायर का ही है, लेकिन उसमें गुप्ता और वाकाटकास को मिला करके दिखाया गया है। ये दो लार्ज किंगडम्स थे। गुप्ताज वेयर एम्पायर और वाकाटकास एक लार्ज किंगडम था जो विंध्या रीजन से और आज के तेलंगाना और महाराष्ट्र और उत्तरी कर्नाटका रीजन सारा उसमें इंक्लूडेड था। इन दोनों के बीच में अच्छा संबंध था। गुप्ता, मैं भूल रहा हूं, लेकिन किसी गुप्ता सम्राट की बेटी की शादी वाकाटकास के यहाँ हुई थी, और गुप्ताज ने वाकाटकास के साथ मिल करके पश्चिमी एरियाज गुजरात वगैरह को गुप्ता साम्राज्य में मिलाया था। तो अगर ये मैप इसलिए मैं दिखा रहा हूं कि ये एक ही साम्राज्य है, और ये साम्राज्य जो है लगभग पूरे उपमहाद्वीप को, भारतीय उपमहाद्वीप को कवर करता है। एक लार्ज एम्पायर, पॉलिटिकल स्टेबिलिटी, लेटर ऑन हम लोग देखेंगे, जिसको हम संस्कृत कॉस्मोपोलिस कहेंगे। मैं अपने से आगे नहीं दौड़ना चाहता, आगे नहीं निकलना चाहता, लेकिन यह ध्यान रखिएगा कि ये उस संस्कृत क्लासिकल एरा का पॉलिटिकल मैप है। और उसके बाद जब आप 700 से 1100 के ईस्वी के बीच में आते हैं, तो आप देखते हैं कि पूरा नॉर्थ इंडिया पॉलिटिकली विभाजित है, बटा हुआ है। दर्जनों बड़े राजाओं और सैकड़ों छोटे छोटे राजाओं में बटा हुआ है। तो पॉलिटिकल फ्रैगमेंटेशन जो है, राजनीतिक बिखराव पूरे उपमहाद्वीप का, स्पेशली नॉर्थ इंडिया का, क्योंकि साउथ में बड़े किंगडम्स थे उस पीरियड में, नॉर्थ इंडिया का राजनीतिक बिखराव 700 से 1100 के बीच में है। और फिर उसके बाद आप देखते हैं कि 1300 के आसपास का ये मैप है दिल्ली सल्तनत का। उस समय तुगलक डायनेस्टी चल रही थी, और ये कुछ हिस्सों को छोड़ करके पूरब में और एक्सट्रीम दक्षिण में कुछ हिस्सों को छोड़ करके पूरा सब कॉन्टिनेंट ये कवर किए हुए है। तो फिर एक तरह का राजनीतिक साम्राज्य और राजनीतिक स्थायित्व इस पीरियड में दिखाई पड़ता है। और उसके बाद मुगल आते हैं। ऑफ कोर्स दिल्ली सल्तनत कमजोर पड़ता है, तभी बाबर हराते हैं इब्राहिम लोदी को 1526 में। और बाद में जब मुगल साम्राज्य बनता है, तो मुगल साम्राज्य का ये मैप है, जिसमें आप नीली रेखा में घिरा हुआ एरिया छोटा सा काबुल के इर्द गिर्द देख रहे हैं। बाबर ने वहीं से शुरू किया था, लेकिन सारा पीला एरिया जो है वो अकबर ने जोड़ा था, और सारा नारंगी एरिया जो है वो औरंगजेब ने जोड़ा था। और इन सारे एरियाज को अगर जोड़ दिया जाए, काबुल से लेकर नीचे पौंडीचेरी और कोचीन तक के नजदीक तक, तो ये सारा एरिया जो है वो मुगल साम्राज्य, औरंगजेब का पीरियड जो था, पीक था मुगल साम्राज्य का, उसमें ये सारा एरियाज कवर्ड है। एक बार फिर ये राजनीतिक, ये साम्राज्य की राजनीतिक विशालता को और स्थायित्व को दिखलाता है। और उसके बाद जब अंग्रेजों के आने से पहले 1750-60 के आसपास का उत्तर भारत ऐसा है, फिर एक बार बिखरा हुआ, राजनीतिक तौर पर बिखरा हुआ, दर्जनों बड़े स्टेट्स और कई दर्जन या मे बी सैकड़ों छोटे छोटे स्टेट्स। ये दिखाने का कारण ये था कि हम पूरे इतिहास को, पूरे उपमहाद्वीप के लंबे इतिहास को देखें, 1000 साला इतिहास में देखें, तो दो मेजर पीरियड्स ऐसे आते हैं जिसमें राजनीतिक बिखराव है और सांस्कृतिक डिक्लाइन है, सांस्कृतिक क्या कहेंगे, उतराव है, पराभव है उसमें। एक पीरियड 700 से 1100 का है, हर्षवर्धन जो 606 से 647 तक रूल किया जिन्होंने, हर्षवर्धन के पीरियड के बाद बिखराव और फ्रेगमेंटेशन, बिखराव और डिक्लाइन का पीरियड है। और दूसरा बड़ा पीरियड ऐसा जो आता है, जो बिखराव का और उतार का पीरियड आता है, वो औरंगजेब के बाद आता है और अंग्रेजों के आने से पहले आता है। मैं इसलिए ये दिखा रहा हूं कि आप दोनों केसेस में देखेंगे कि पूरे सबकॉन्टिनेंट में जो साम्राज्य थे और जो उसके साथ जुड़ी हुई जो संस्कृत सभ्यता थी, वो हारती है इन्हीं पीरियड, इन्हीं बिखराव और उतरान के पीरियड में। 1100 के बाद 1200 से 1000 के आसपास आपने देखा पहली टाइमलाइन में कि गजनी के आक्रमण होते हैं, सोमनाथ वगैरह टेम्पल वगैरह वाले किस्से होते हैं, और 1206 में दिल्ली सल्तनत की शुरुआत होती है। तो एक तरह से मुस्लिम रूलर्स आते हैं और थोड़े ही दिनों के अंदर पूरे सबकॉन्टिनेंट पर हावी होते हैं, और वो यहीं के हो जाते हैं। दूसरा पीरियड जिसमें अंग्रेज आते हैं, थोड़े से अंग्रेज आकर पूरे सबकॉन्टिनेंट को गुलाम बना लेते हैं 100 साल के अंदर, वो पीरियड भी इसलिए संभव होता है, अंग्रेजों का जीतना भी इसलिए संभव होता है क्योंकि पूरी भारतीय सभ्यता, हिंदू मुस्लिम सारा मिलाकर वो अंग्रेजों के सामने टिकती नहीं है, हारती है, क्योंकि राजनीतिक बिखराव है और सांस्कृतिक उतराव है। तो ये मैं कह रहा था। ओके, सो अब हम आते हैं जो इमीडिएट जो आफ्टरमाथ ऑफ क्लासिकल एरा पर आपको याद होगा शुरू। ओके, लेट मी स्पीक फर्स्ट इन इंग्लिश, या सो लेट मी नाउ वी कम टू द prehistory of Bhakti movement, and the early prehistory of Bhakti movement, which is the immediate aftermath of the classical era. I think I will just read it. I mean, these slides are very uneven. I mean, even though what we are discussing today, we have been learning and discussing for quite a bit of time, so one has quite a bit of things to say, but these slides are prepared very hurriedly. So they are very uneven. Sometimes there are comments like slides, and sometimes they are just reminder to me about what I should not forget. So, I mean, this is more comment-like, so I will just read it out. The classical era, 300 to 600 CE, was characterized by the consolidation of let me, I can't see my whole slide itself. Let me do this. Okay. Brahminical consolidation of Brahminical orthodoxy and Sanskrit cosmopolis. I mean, without explaining, I have used this word, and I will not go into the detail of explaining this term. That is a topic in itself. But roughly, you can have a mental picture of high philosophy, literature, Sanskrit literature, all the dramatist theater, and the plays that were written in Sanskrit, astronomy, mathematics, statecraft, like even though Kautilya's Arthashastra is popularly known to have been written in Maurya times, but there are evidences or indications that it may have been completed in the classical era. So all these things put together is known. I mean, somebody has coined this term Sanskrit cosmopolis, which includes the high culture. It is cities, shahri, urbanities, nobles, ganikas. I mean, just I think you will understand why I have especially mentioned ganikas, because they played a big role in urban culture and even in politics. There are plays and stories about them, even epics written about, in which one famous ganika was the principal character. So these were high class entertainers and even providers of sexual services to upper class people. So this is just to count the image of the classical era, make an image of the classical era. Away from these urban centers, you remember this is 300 to 600 CE. Away from these urban centers, vast forested hinterland was being incorporated. This process was on. Gradually, it was they were being incorporated into a new agricultural economy. Tribal cultures of the hinterlands were being incorporated into the Brahminical order. But this was having an impact on the Brahminical order and Brahminical culture itself, and which was being bringing in transmutations of plebeian character, mass character into the Brahminical Hinduism. So this, most of the things, the Sanskrit cosmopolis was confined to the cities and around. And as you moved away from the cities, there was a big transformation and big struggle going on. All of India was forested and tribal communities lived there. And they were being turned into, incorporated into agricultural economies and being made part of the imperial economy. The rule of Harshvardhan, 606 to 647, somewhat delayed the disintegration of the classical era, which happened rapidly. The disintegration happened rapidly after his demise. The fragmentation of North Indian polity had begun by the middle of 7th century. This was different from South India, where post-Satavahana kingdoms of Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, Cholas, Pallavas, Pandyas, Cheras, and many others, they held sway in large regions of the South in different periods during the 5th to 14th centuries. So South was politically better organized, compared to North in the post-classical era. The institutional framework of religions in North India evolved along the dual path of monasteries and temples. So, now we are talking mostly of the immediate aftermath of the classical era. And these monasteries and temples, they were different in categories and functions. Monasteries were pioneered by the shamanic religions, especially Buddhism and Jainism, especially Buddhism. And they were the natural institutions. Monasteries in Hindi or Sanskrit, we call it matha, mathas. So they were the natural institutions to start with as far as the shamanic religions, Buddhism and Jainism, were concerned. But temples, the places of idol worship and certain rituals and so on, and temples were open to the masses. You didn't need to be an initiate, an expert to go to a temple and worship, but monasteries were for specially initiated religious functionaries, especially trained religious functionaries. So these temples also evolved with Buddha. When Buddha was himself turned into a deity, and his images, Buddhists, or certain sects of Buddhists started praying to, and the concept of bodhisattva and all that. So both monasteries and temples, very different from each other in functions and institutional, character. Both of them evolved, largely with Buddhism, but both of them became integral part of Hindu religious institutional framework. In later developments within Hinduism, monasteries will be the main institutions for tantrics, yogis, and Nirgun Bhakti sect. We will see that difference, when we come to that discussions, that the monasteries, mathas, were more the natural habitat for tantrics and yogis and Nirgun Bhakti sects. I will come to these terms. If you don't know Nirgun Bhakti, what is that? And temples will dominate the institutional framework of Vaishnava Bhakts and later Saguna Bhaktas of North India, also of Shaiva and Shakta Bhaktas. But in North India, Shaiva and Shakta Bhaktas did not play as important role. We will see Vaishnava Bhaktas were the dominant ones. Shakta Bhaktas were in the East Bengal part, and Shaivas were were interspersed everywhere. But Vaishnav Bhakta, Vaishnav Saguna Bhakta, they became dominant. We will see how. This separation between the mathas and the mandirs, between the monasteries and the temples was never clean. And this is typical of Hinduism. Most practices of popular Hinduism, the institutional practice, like most practices of popular Hinduism, institutional practices were also mixed and amalgamated. So, the temples, there will be mathas, associated with the temples in vicinity of each other. So the organizers of the temple will live in mathas nearby, and the temple's doors will be, the deity will be in the temple, and there the doors will be open to the masses, but not the doors of the mathas will be open to the masses. And this system continues even till today, more or less with many variations, but this system continues till today. Okay. So in Hindi, this part, ये 600 से 700 का पीरियड है, जो क्लासिकल एरा, गुप्ता एम्पायर के खत्म होने के बाद का पीरियड है. इस पीरियड में क्लासिकल एरा में, गुप्ता एम्पायर में के दौरान जो ब्राह्मणी व्यवस्था थी और जो संस्कृत का हाई कल्चर था, वो डोमिनेट करता था. अर्बन कल्चर था संस्कृत कॉस्मोपोलिस का. लेकिन अगर अर्बन सेंटर से दूर जाएं तो सारा उपमहाद्वीप जो था वो ज्यादातर जंगल था, और आदिवासी कम्युनिटीज रहती थी उसमें, और बहुत बड़ा प्रोसेस ऑन था जिसमें जंगल काटे जा रहे थे, और कबीलाओं को, कबीलाई समाज को या आदिवासी समाज को कृषि की अर्थव्यवस्था में जोड़ा जा रहा था और साम्राज्य की अर्थव्यवस्था के अंदर ले आया जा रहा था. वहां पर जो ब्राह्मणिकल व्यवस्था, सांस्कृतिक व्यवस्था का जो स्ट्रगल और लेन देन चल रहा था पुरानी आदिवासी व्यवस्था के साथ, उसकी वजह से असर दो तरफा था. आदिवासी व्यवस्था ब्राह्मणिकल व्यवस्था में इनकॉर्पोरेट की जा रही थी, लेकिन ब्राह्मणिकल व्यवस्था को भी अपना रूप बदलना पड़ रहा था. उसके डिटेल्स में हम नहीं जा रहे हैं, लेकिन ये ध्यान में रखिएगा. हर्षवर्धन का पीरियड जो है वो थोड़ा एम्पायर का, साम्राज्य का पीरियड के डिसइंटीग्रेशन को बस डिले करता है उत्तर भारत में. हर्षवर्धन के तुरंत बाद उत्तर भारत का राजनीतिक फ्रैगमेंटेशन, बिखराव शुरू हो जाता है. दक्षिण में ये कहानी थोड़ी अलग थी. दक्षिण में ईसा के समय के आसपास के सातवाहन, प्रसिद्ध सातवाहन राजाओं के उपरांत उसके बाद आने वाले बहुत से बड़े और छोटे राजा वहां पर राजनीतिक व्यवस्था पूरे दक्षिण की संभाले हुए थे, अलग अलग टाइम्स में और अलग अलग एरियाज में. चालुक्याज, राष्ट्रकूटाज, चोलाज, पल्लवाज, पांड्याज, चेराज, ये सारे जो किंगडम्स थे, ये साउथ को एक ज्यादा व्यवस्थित राजनीतिक स्वरूप दिए हुए थे, जबकि उत्तर भारत में ये पीरियड, बिखराव का पीरियड शुरू हो रहा था. और जो धर्मों का जो 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 इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क, जो संस्थागत रूप था, वो दो लाइनों पे चला. दो तरह के संस्थान उभरे, एक मोनास्ट्रीज या जिनको मठ कहेंगे, और दूसरा जिसे जो टेम्पल्स हैं या मंदिर हैं. मोनास्ट्रीज के सिस्टम की शुरुआत ज्यादातर बौद्धों के द्वारा की गई थी, मठों की शुरुआत. और मंदिर वाला भी एक तरह से देखा जाए कि पायनियर्स बौद्ध ही थे. जब बुद्ध को ही भगवान बना दिया गया और बुद्ध की प्रतिमाओं की पूजा की जाने लगी, तो एक तरह से मंदिरों के ठीक पहले की प्रोटो टेम्पल काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स की शुरुआत बुद्धिज्म में ही हो जाती है, जो हिंदुइज्म जिसको पूरी तरह से विकसित करता है. हिंदुइज्म इन दोनों चीजों को अडॉप्ट करता है, मोनास्ट्रीज को भी, मठों को भी और मंदिरों को भी. और इन दोनों ही रास्तों से जो हिंदू धर्म की जो सांस्थानिक संरचना जो विकसित होती है, इन दोनों आधारों पर विकसित होती है, और दोनों एक दूसरे से इंटरैक्ट करते हैं. और जो उत्तर भारत का में इस पीरियड में 700 से 1100 के बीच में विकसित होता हुआ हिंदुइज्म है, उसमें आगे हम अभी देखेंगे कि तांत्रिक और भक्त के बीच का विभाजन देखेंगे, और तांत्रिक और योगी और भक्तों में से जो निर्गुण भक्त थे वो ज्यादातर मोनास्ट्रीज वाले संस्थागत रूप पर आधारित थे, और जो दूसरे भक्त थे, जो डोमिनेंट भक्त थे, वैष्णव भक्त थे, ज्यादातर सगुण भक्त थे, वो ज्यादातर मंदिरों वाले फ्रेमवर्क में के पर आधारित थे। हालांकि ये सेपरेशन, ये अलगाव बिल्कुल साफ अलगाव नहीं था, दोनों एक दूसरे से मिले जुले थे। हिंदू धर्म में ज्यादातर चीजें अमेलगमेटेड होती हैं, कोई भी चीज खत्म भी नहीं होती, और पुरानी पढ़ने के, नई चीजों के शुरू होने के साथ पुरानी चीजें कभी पूरी तरह खत्म नहीं होती, एक तरह का एमलगम तैयार होता चलता है। और आज तक ये व्यवस्था बनी हुई है जिसमें मंदिरों के पास अक्सर उनके ऑर्गेनाइजर्स के मठ वाले, मोनास्ट्रीज वाले, आश्रम मोनास्ट्रीज वाले स्वरूप आज तक चल रहे हैं। तो मठों का और मंदिरों का संयुक्त रूप, ये इंस्टीट्यूशनल फ्रेमवर्क जो क्लासिकल एरा के इमीडिएट आफ्टर माथ में विकसित हुआ था। ओके, सो then we come to one of the key parts of our discussion, the tantric age in North India, that is from 700 to 1200. I am just throwing lot of introductory accounts to you. These are vast subjects, and I am really, now that I am reading and educating myself a bit about our own history, I am amazed how much literature is there, but I will just if my purpose will be served if you become familiar with some of these terms and their time periods, so that it becomes part of your mental picture of India in those times. So tantric scriptures known as tantras or agamas or samhitas, they were largely composed during 5th and 13th century. But the roots of these tantric theologies and principles go back to even to Vedas and Mimamsa, Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta, the Indian philosophical systems. And they always refer to very early roots, but systematic theological scriptures were known as tantras or agamas or samhitas, were composed mostly during 5th to 13th century. Tantric denominations, there were many, and most of the religious denominations of Hinduism, they had their tantric, counterparts. They included tantrism in them, as a subsect or something, which became dominant in this era. So tantric denominations, there were Shaivas, Shaktas, Vaishnavas, Sauras, one who worshipped sun, and even Vajrayani Buddhism, and some certain sects of Jains. All major religious denominations had their versions of tantrism during this period. There were famous tantric sects known as Kapalikas or Kalamukhas or Nath Yogis and so on. In North Indian Hindi literature, Nath Yogi is very well known sect, and they gave rise to some literature, and the Bhakti, especially Nirgun Bhakti, was had their antecedents in that. We will come to all these things a little later. Tantric theologies, had three key terms: Mukti, which is spiritual salvation; Siddhi, which is attaining sadhakas, the initiates, the practitioners attaining extraordinary powers, and when they attained those powers, they were called Siddh, and Bhukti, which is extreme enjoyments or pleasures. And these theologies were based on a conception of the divine as immanent and accessible power. Immanent means, existing within, and largely, immanent meant, existing within the body, And so these conception of divine was immanent and accessible power that can be deployed for all three goals: Mukti, Siddhi, or Bhukti, Tantric sadhana aims at turning the body of the sadhaka into the body of a deity. देवता, अपने शरीर में ही देवता बन जाना, या अपने शरीर को देवरूप दे देना. Tantric practices were largely corporeal, physical, bodily, practices were there. They were also mystical, occult, and magical. They had these occult and mystical technologies, mystical as well as magical technologies, the entire gamut of yantras, mandalas, chakras, and they had these bodily technologies, these terms like kundalani, ida, pingala, these, veins or nerves, whatever, and so on. All these terms are technical terms in the sadhak technologies, of the tantric practices. They had hatha yoga postures, methods of meditation, and they also has technologies of healing. For example, one of the key features, dominant those days, but hasn't gone away even in the modern era, treatment of demonic possessions. Individuals are possessed by demons, and then these tantrics have to, chase away these demons through certain practices, processes, technologies. And they even had healings for people who had snake bites, poisons, so whatever that is called, de-poison them. They were, major healers of many different kinds of diseases and bodily dysfunctions, including sexual dysfunctions. And one doesn't know how widespread or how small, but it was quite common and it is very well known. And don't think that I'm trying to defame anything. It is just integral part of the tantric practice, what modern writers have very mildly described as transgressive tantric practices, which includes the 5 M's, panchamakar, madhya, liquor, mans, meat, matsya, fish, mudra. Mudra generally is taken as coin, but it is here, there mudra means, some special parched kind of grain, and mathuna, sexual intercourse. These 5 M's were part of their practices. Ritualistic sex, including religious ritualistic sex, including extremely deviant practices, were common in these transgressive sects, and there were, I don't know how to describe it in English, aghori practices, such as, they did all kinds of grotesque experiments of consuming excreta, piss, semen, and so on, mal mutra virya, and so on. All kinds of experiments were done, and these transgressive sects and practices were well known, and no one can say that they have completely disappeared in the period that followed. So the हिंदी में तांत्रिक एज जो नॉर्थ इंडिया का है, थोड़ा आप हमें टाइम अलाउ करेंगे, क्योंकि मुझे हिंदी भी बोलनी पड़ रही है, यानी 2 भाषाओं में बोलना पड़ रहा है। मैं हमेशा टाइम के बारे में बड़ा दबाव महसूस करता हूँ। तांत्रिक स्क्रिप्चर्स लिखे गए, तंत्राज, आगमाज, संहिताज 5वीं से 13वीं सदी के बीच में, लेकिन उनकी जड़ें बहुत पुराने समय तक क्लेम की जाती हैं, वेदाज, मीमांसा, सांख्य योग और वेदांत में भी। तांत्रिक जो सेक्ट्स थे, डिनोमिनेशंस थे, क्या कहेंगे उनको, तांत्रिक जो भाग उपभाग थे, वो उसमें हिंदू धर्म के जितने डिनोमिनेशंस थे, सब में तांत्रिक प्रैक्टिसेस जुड़ी हुई थी या उनके सेक्शन के रूप में थी। शैव, शाक्त, वैष्णव, शौर्य, वज्रयान बुद्धिज्म में भी, जैनों में भी, सारे इन डिनोमिनेशंस के से निकलकर तांत्रिज्म इन सभी से जुड़ा हुआ था और सभी से निकला हुआ था। तांत्रिक सेक्ट्स, फेमस मेजर तांत्रिक सेक्ट लाइक कपालिकाज, कलामुखाज, नाथ योगीज को हिंदी वाले ज्यादा जानते हैं, जो लोग हिंदी साहित्य मध्यकाल का पढ़ते हैं। तांत्रिक जो धर्मशास्त्र था या थियोलॉजी थी, उसमें 3 टर्म्स, 3 उद्देश्य, 3 एम्स मुख्य थे। मुक्ति यानी आध्यात्मिक मुक्ति, सिद्धि यानी एक्स्ट्राऑर्डिनरी पावर्स, यानी ऐसे शक्ति अर्जित करना, साधकों के पास अंतर्धान हो जाने की शक्ति, दूसरे के शरीर में प्रवेश कर जाने की शक्ति, तथा कथित ये सारे सिद्धि कहे जाएंगे। और भुक्ति मीन्स भोग, वहीं से वो शब्द निकलता है, तरह तरह के भोग के रूप। ये इस थियोलॉजी में, तांत्रिक थियोलॉजी में लार्जली जो ईश्वर है या जो देवता है, सर्वोच्च देवता है, वो शरीर में ही स्थित है, और उसे साधक अपने साधना के जरिए अपने शरीर को देवता के शरीर में परिणत कर सकता है, और उसे इन तीनों उद्देश्यों की प्राप्ति के लिए, मुक्ति, सिद्धि और भुक्ति तीनों की प्राप्ति में लगा सकता है। जो प्रैक्टिसेस थी तांत्रिकों की, वो ज्यादातर शारीरिक थी, कुछ मिस्टिकल, रहस्यवादी भी थी, ऑकल्ट भी उसी तरह का शब्द है, और मैजिकल, जादू वाली थी। जो बहुत सारी कोट अनकोट टेक्नोलॉजीज थी, जिसमें यंत्र, मंडल, चक्र, ये मेजर कंपोनेंट्स थे या टर्म्स थे, और बहुत सारी शारीरिक टेक्नोलॉजीज थी, कुंडलिनी जगाना और ईड़ा और पिंगला नाड़ियों की चर्चा आप हमेशा इस प्रकार के साहित्य में पढ़ते और सुनते हैं। हठ योग उसमें सम्मिलित था, ध्यान, मेडिटेशन सम्मिलित था, और उसमें हीलिंग का, उपचार के टेक्नोलॉजीज भी थी, जिसमें भूत उतारने का सबसे प्रधान कार्य होता था तांत्रिकों का। लोगों पर भूत आ जाता था तो उसको भगाना, भूत भगाना। और प्रैक्टिकल चीजें जैसे सांप का चढ़ा उतार, सांप के सर्पदंश का इलाज करना, और दूसरे डिजीजेस का भी, दूसरे रोगों का भी इलाज करना, इंक्लूडिंग सेक्सुअल रोगों का भी इलाज करना, ये तांत्रिकों का काम आता था। और आज तक आप देखेंगे बड़े बड़े शहरों में भी टेंट लगा करके ऐसे कबीले टाइप घूमने वाले लोग जो तरह तरह की दवाओं का और तरह तरह की टेक्नोलॉजीज का प्रचार करते हैं, पूरा गया नहीं है तांत्रिक पद्धति आज तक। और आखिर में बहुत ही मतलब आज की सेंसिटिविटीज के लिए, कल्चर सेंसिटिविटीज के लिए इनकी बात करना भी मुश्किल है। ऐसी अतिवादी तांत्रिक प्रैक्टिसेस जैसे पंचमकार, मध्य, मांस, मत्स्य, मुद्रा, मैथुन, और एक तरह से साधना के अंग के रूप में सेक्सुअल इंटरकोर्स, और अघोरी प्रैक्टिसेस जैसे मलमूत्र, वीर्य का पान, ये बहुत कुछ इस पे लिखा गया है। इसके बाकायदा श्लोक और मंत्र हैं और तरीके हैं। और तांत्रिक सेक्लूडेड सेक्ट्स और प्रैक्टिसेस, ये नहीं कहा जा सकता कि आज भी हिंदुस्तान से पूरी तरह गायब हुए हैं। Again, Tantric age in North India continued. I will just read it out. Transgressing the Brahminical orthodoxy and Varnashram Vyavastha. So the positive aspect was that it was, Tantric, Tantrism challenged Brahminical orthodoxy, and challenged the Varnashram Vyavastha. It was open to all castes, or most castes, you can say. But it maintained a separation from the common masses because it was a sect of sadhakas, practitioners, largely a secretive order of select initiates, sadhakas, in secluded monasteries, but became increasingly open. During this period, it became increasingly open and influential in society at large as the Tantric age progressed away from the classical era. In this period of disintegration or fragmentation that I talked about, Tantric order became much more open and much more widespread in the society at large. Interaction of secluded monastic cultures and devotional temple culture, as I said, monasteries pioneered by Buddhists and Jains came closer to temples pioneered by ritualistic as well as devotional Brahminism, with earlier roots in the deification and image worship of Buddha. I have repeated it here. An importance of gurus and sadhakas, religious economy is spreading out to the society at large through Tantrism. In this era, Tantrism was the biggest vehicle of taking religious practices and turning into society at large and turning them into, and at least having mass influence. In the increasingly fragmented polity of North India, numerous kings and regional lords seeking popular legitimation through association with tantric gurus. When we are talking of fragmentation of North India, and kings, even kings came to these tantric gurus and sought their blessings. And in fact, this became such an important part, this kind of royal patronage or kingly patronage became such an important part, and they became such a market that the tantric system came up with something called Nirbij Diksha, initiation for the kings, in which concessions were given, and the kings were initiated into Tantrism through a process which did not require the rigors of daily sadhana. Concessions were given to kings. So you can see this. I have mentioned how prevalent it became, and how even the kings of North India, came under the spell of Tantrism. Many of them, especially the smaller ones. High culture and Brahminical orthodoxy, characteristic of Sanskrit cosmopolis, were increasingly diluted, quote unquote corrupted, or they were largely dissolved. This gives rise to an iske reaction. In reaction to this came up the Bhakti Vedantic stream initiated by Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya was a premier, quote unquote, reformer of Hinduism, and the Hinduism was feeling this pressure of Tantrism, which was decadent, in many eyes, at least in the Brahminical eyes, which was being challenged by it. And also it was feeling the pressure for almost a millennium, right from the time of Buddha, the Buddhist pressure. And Shankaracharya tried to revive Bhakti Vedantic classical Hinduism through assertion of classical Brahminical Hinduism, as well as trying to find a way to make it popular. And Bhakti came, Bhakti Marg, became an important component of such a cerebral and intellectual philosopher as Shankaracharya. So this was completes the Tantric age in North India. Now so after Tantrism, what I mentioned at the end, the Brahminical reaction, the Brahminical response, we can say, Bhakti Marg of Vedantins in the 19th to 13th centuries. Theological origins, was claimed to be in the Upanishad, especially Shvetashvara, also in epics, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita promotes Bhakti Marg. Also in Puranas, and the doctrines the paths included Gyan Marg, Karma Marg, and Bhakti Marg. Just to remind you, Shankaracharya again, who propounded Advait Vedant, was in this period. A little later, Ramanujacharya, who kind of critiqued and challenged Shankaracharya with his Vishishtadvait Vedant. And around the same time, maybe a little later, Madhvacharya, who propounded Dvait Vedant. These were three major philosopher saints, of the Sanskritic Bhakti Marg. All these acharyas propounding the efficacy, the success of Bhakti Marg for the salvation of the average soul, where Brahmins largely subscribing to the Brahminical order, but they also advocated flexibility and liberalism in different degrees and opened the road to salvation for the Shudras too. So some liberalism came to the caste system or the Varnashram Vyavastha, and their influence was largely on the Saguna stream of Bhakti movement in North India. So when we come to that period, core period of Bhakti movement, we will see that the Bhakti movement is splits into two streams, Nirguna Bhakti and Saguna Bhakti. I will explain it later. The Vaishnav Bhakti Marg, Vaishnav Vedantin Bhakti Marg was particularly influential in the Saguna stream. Ramanand, who probably lived around 1300 to 1380, was the important transitional figure among Vaishnava Acharyas. He was a Brahmin and a follower of Ramanuja, but his philosophy as well as practice transcended Varna and caste boundaries. His famous stories of embracing Raidas or embracing Shudras, and completely against untouchability, and such caste boundaries. He played an important role in North Indian Bhakti movement, influencing many Nirgun saint poets like Kabir, Ravidas, and others, and also Brahman Sagun poets such as Tulsidas. Okay, so that much about the Brahminical response and its adoption of Bhakti Marg. Now, then comes Islam. Although Islam had come as early as 712 when Arabs had conquered Sindh, but that hardly had any impact on the subcontinent. Actually, Islam's, this is wrong, this is not 100, 1000. Raid of Mahmud Ghazni between 1000 and 1026. Defeat of Prithviraj Chauhan, I am just reminding you, 1192, 1206 inauguration of Delhi Sultanate. Interaction of then in this period, in the Delhi Sultanate period, starts the interaction of Sanskrit cosmopolis, which was, or its remnants, it was in the decay, with the Persianate cosmopolis, the rulers, of the Delhi Sultanate. They promote the Persianate high culture, and thus comes, through this interaction comes the Indo-Persian high culture, that is in the courtly culture in the Sultanate courts and later Mughal courts. Along with that, also at the mass level, at the grassroots level, popular Sufism spreads, and with the arrival of Islam, it becomes clear, with the arrival of Islam and the influence of Vedantic, different streams of Vedantic Bhakti Marg and Bhakti Acharyas, Tantrism goes on a decline. And under the double impact of decline of Tantrism and impact of Vedantic Bhakti and Sufism, arises the Bhakti movement in North India proper. I have to mention this too, because Sufism is a key influence. Sufism is nearly as old as Islam itself, but its mass influence spread greatly in the aftermath of the Mongol invasions on the Arab and Persian Muslim world. Popular Islam came under an extensive influence of various sects of Sufism and of charismatic Sufi saints. This I am talking of Arab, Iran, Afghanistan, not of India. Sufism arose, it is as old as Islam, but it went through many, many changes, and it became popular later, especially after the Mongol invasions on the Arab and Persian Muslim land. The spiritual authority of Sufi saints was recognized even by Muslim rulers who needed their blessings for popular legitimacy. There was a large influx of Sufis into the Sultanate North India after Mongol invasions. Mongol invasions, by always that mean, one key episode was the sacking of Baghdad in 1258, which is taken as a period of decline of Islamic cultural glory. Mass Sufism had a great religious cultural impact on the North Indian society. It was in turn greatly influenced by Indian religious theologies and practices. So here, the effect was twofold. Sufism became the mass popular mode of a spread of Islam in India, And in this process, Sufism adopted many of the religious elements, from then prevalent Hinduism, both Bhakti Marg and both Bhakti kind and Tantric kind, Sufi influence spread through saints and their khankas, dargahs, Chishti Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia, for example, who lived between 1242 to 1325, had a great influence all across North India, and some influence he had even in parts of South. The mass literary and urban culture of Hindavi emerged under the trans-religious influence of Sufism. Trans-religious means, which included Hindus and Muslims, and also under the Indo-Persian cosmopolis. So Hindavi was something that was on the borderline of high culture and mass culture and religious and literary. I mean, the typical example, great significant example was the genius of Amir Khusro, who played a key role in development of a new language, Hindavi, and brought the forms of ghazal and qawwalis and all kinds of things into Hindavi, and he was a music genius. He was a great poet, multifaceted personality, Sufis interacted with tantric and yogic practices, especially Nath yogis, and adopted, or rather Islamized, some of their practices, despite great theological differences. Indianized version of Sufi mysticism appeared in the literary forms of premakhyans. There are famous premakhyans or epics, Maulana Dawood's Chandayan in 1379, Kutuban's Mirigavati in 1503, Malik Muhammad Jayasi's Padmavat 1540, and Manjhan's Madhumalati 1545. They were all written in local dialects, a mixture of Hindavi, Braj Bhasha, and so on, and Avadhi. And they became these Sufi great poets, contributed a great deal to the early emergence of Hindavi literature. And the last point that influences the Bhakti movement is the vernacular revolution. Vernacular revolution, local language, emergence of local languages as opposed to Sanskrit and Prakrit, had started much earlier in South India. In Tamil land, it had started much earlier, 5th, 6th century perhaps. Old Tamil is even older, pre-Christ. In Kannada, for example, the emergence of Kannada language in 9th, 10th centuries. Vernacular revolution made its way to North India through Maharashtra and Gujarat, 13th to 16th century. Literature of saint poets. Vernacular revolution made its way to North India through Maharashtra and Gujarat, 13th to 16th century. Literature of saint poets of North India in 15th to 17th century in local languages and dialects, especially Braj Bhasha and Avadhi, although there were earlier examples too, such as literature of Nath yogis in the Tantric era. So this vernacular emergence, vernacular revolution comes a little later to North India, and literature starts getting produced, especially of saint poets in Braj Bhasha and Avadhi and many other local languages. So now we come to Bhakti movement. I realize that I am not speaking in Hindi, but we can discuss more in Hindi once I can go back to the slides, depending on in the discussion part in Hindi more. Let me finish this in Hindi because I am running out of time. So Bhakti movement in North India, 1400 to 1700, there were 4 sources. I have counted these 4 sources in the previous slides. So Tantrism, although tantrics, Bhakti movement arises largely in opposition to Tantrism. Tantrism is the other of Bhakti, you can say. And yet the tantrics too had devotional elements, in them and in their theology and practice. Bhakti movement arose in opposition to Tantrism, and yet proximity of Tantrism, especially of Nath yogis, to Nirgun stream of Bhakti despite intense opposition. This is clear. Nirgun stream of Bhakti was very close to Tantrism, even though Nirgun saint poets always rebuked and mocked and criticized tantrics. The second source was Vaishnavite Bhakti Marg, initiated by Shankaracharya. Third source was that fed into the Bhakti movement was Sufism, and fourth source was the vernacular revolution. I have just given a map. There is no time, otherwise you could go into this. This is a map just taken from Howley's book, A Storm of Songs, in which different saint poets from different areas and roughly their time periods. So, as I said, the Bhakti movement was split into 2 separate streams in North India. This is a peculiarity of North Indian Bhakti movement. Even though it can be seen its imprints even in South, but South, this separation was not that prominent. In South, the Bhakti movement has proceeded more along Shakta and Shaiva and Vaishnava, basically Shaiva and Vaishnava streams, which will conceptually all be largely incorporated into the Saguna stream. Nirguna stream is the theology is abstract and formless God. It was influenced by monotheism, like, Islam and Christianity and so on. Influence of Sufism and Islam, but also of Sankhya, Yoga, and even Vedanta. There were monotheistic or abstract gods concept even in the Indian systems. It was opposed to Tantrism, and yet it was influenced by it. Its social ideologies, for which it is lauded, it is praised by today's social critics of caste system and so on. Social ideologies were reformists, and some were even revolutionaries in this respect. It was transgressive of opposed to varnashram and caste boundaries and regulations. Nearly all the saint poets of the Nirguna stream were non-Brahmins, and most came from lower castes and outcasts. Major saint poets, for example, Kabir, 1300 to 1518, as I said, whether he lived for 120 years or not, no one knows, came from a Muslim weaver's family, although the legend has it that he was the son of a Brahmin widow. Later, a sect developed in his name, Kabir Panth. Legend also has it that he was a disciple of Ramanand, the founder of Ramanandi Sampradaya, again, there is a lot of controversy in the Hindi literatures about, Ramanand, his actual historical persona and his interaction with Kabir. His language and religious terminology influenced by Nath yogis, and yet he rebuked them for their non-spirituality, the Nath yogis' non-spirituality, and for their involvement with power, pleasure, occult, and magic. Ravidas, the other poet who came from the untouchable caste, who was a leather worker, many of his followers also identify themselves as Ravidasi, as a panth in his name, and legend also has it that he too was a disciple of Ramanand. And then there was Guru Nanak, if you were to select, just a few names, just to give you a flavor and an indication of that period. He was the founder of Sikhism, although it is doubtful that he ever intended to found a separate religion. Sikhism took the definite shape of a separate religion, starting with 5th Guru Arjan or 6th Guru Hargobind. Sikhism adopted a political and militaristic dimensions, starting with Guru Hargobind. But if you just look at Guru Nanak, he was a typical example of a Nirguna saint poet. The other stream was Saguna stream. The theology was devotion to avatars, anthropomorphic, insan ki tarah dikhne wale, avatar of the supreme God, especially Ram and Krishna, deeply influenced by, and they were followers of Vedantic philosophy and theologies. Their social ideology was mostly conservative as far as caste system was concerned, although occasionally they had reformist elements. Most saint poets, of the Saguna stream were Brahmins. Socially, culturally, politically, the most successful religious stream of the Bhakti era. Saguna stream became the hegemonic, overwhelmingly dominating stream of Bhakti Marg in North India. Major saint poets were Surdas, 16th century blind poet, devotee of Krishna. Tulsidas, everyone knows him as creator of Ramcharitmanas, and his influence continues, gets intensified in various different forms, modern forms of the modern politics, till today. And Mirabai, the woman, 16th century woman saint poet who came from a royal family, and she was a devotee of Krishna. Now I want to point towards the end one key feature of this Vaishnavite, Saguna Bhakti movement. It is often said, there is a lot of debate in the literature about whether it was the response of the Hindu defeat of Hindus at the hands of Muslims. And it is portrayed as if Tulsidas and Ramcharitmanas was written in reaction to that and so on. So that Vaishnavite Bhakti is often opposed to Mughals and Islamic rule, but that actually is is not really true. Actually, Vaishnavite Bhakti was greatly helped by Akbar's rule. The high culture during Akbar's time was far from being only a mirror of the Persianate cosmopolis. The Akbar courts was, Akbar himself was, kind of influenced by various kind of mysticism, and even supposedly it is famous that he went to the Dargah of the Sufi saint, I'm forgetting the name. I think Aulia, Akbar was a syncretic, spiritual, and inclusive in his religious sensibilities. He even tried to start a new religion called Deen-e-Ilahi, which was a combination of all major, Indian Hindu religions. Most important part was that Akbar's system, political system, cannot be imagined without the Kachwaha Rajputs of Amer. They were integral part of Akbar's court, his army, his bureaucracy. And these Kachwaha Rajputs of Amer were great adherents and supporters of Vaishnavite Saguna Bhakti. And through them, Vaishnavite Saguna Bhakti saints became frequent visitors to Akbar's courts, and the whole entire political system had great respect for these many of the Saguna saints. This played a critical role in making Saguna stream the dominant mode of mass Hindu religiosity. This partly contradicts the view that Saguna Bhakti, especially the Ram Bhakti, was antagonistic to the Mughal rule. No. Okay, now I end with two quotes. No. What I have tried to point out is that how the Bhakti movement in India, divided in two streams, Nirguna and Saguna, both were affected. Entire composite Bhakti movement arose under the fourfold influence of Tantric age, of Vaishnavite Shankaracharya's, Acharyas, Bhakti Marg, of Sufi influence, and of vernacular movement. And how it was the Saguna stream became dominant, and Nirguna stream has survived only as some sects, that are confined to their mathas and monasteries. But the large scale mass influence of now North Indian Bhakti movement is that of Saguna, which was the more which could not break away from Brahminical theologies and cultural influences, could not break away from caste system and Varna Vyavastha, even though it did have in bits and pieces liberal elements, and that is the one which has structured or weaved the religious cultural mind of North India, the Saguna stream, especially of Ram Bhakti and also partly Krishna Bhakti, and it is difficult now to pose them as opposed to each other, as it happens in India, especially in the religious sectors of North India. Everything is amalgamated. Even tantrics became incorporated into the dominant Bhakti inspired Hindu religiosity of contemporary India. So I have taken this quote from a book from which I have taken a great deal of help, by Patel Lectures. It's called Genealogy of Devotion, Bhakti, Tantra, Yoga, and Sufism in North India. This book is a recent book published by Columbia University Press in, I think, 2019. And two pieces of quotes, let me just read it, because if I speak on this, I will take more time. So I just brought this in this quote. Dismissive, suspicious, and fearful perceptions of Tantra may be widespread in India today, but they do not give a complete picture of Tantra's real presence in modern India. Tantric practices and notions are, in fact, pervasive in Hinduism today, though Hindus rarely recognize them as Tantric. Most Hindus generally do not appreciate the great impact that the Tantric traditions have had on Hindu religious practice, particularly in the daily worship at private shrines and public temples, wherein Tantric ritual forms and techniques have had an enduring presence. And the second piece, continues, while many in modern while many in modern India intentionally keep their distance from things Tantric, others have no qualms about visiting Tantrikas for the powerful practical services that they can provide. Tantric rites offering quick access to esoteric power actually seem to be in some demand in India today, for there is an abundance of popular vernacular publications on them, often sold near temples, indicating that despite what many say and think about Tantra, Tantric religiosity is still prevalent in practice and perhaps even on the rise in the context of the post-independence India's expanding culture of consumer capitalism. So this I have quoted because I wanted to, having gone through how Bhakti Marg arose in opposition to Tantrism, Tantric stream has been incorporated into the religiosity of modern day North India, which is inspired mostly by Bhakti Marg, Bhakti movement, Bhakti teachings of the Bhakti era, which while starting its journey by opposing Tantrism, has not done away with it. In fact, it has incorporated into its own makeup. And I will end by one last quote, which we will do, if you agree, we will do in next session, which is the impact of Bhakti movement in the colonial period, in the national movement, and in today's India. That part, obviously, I did not have time to do that today. I knew that. That is why I did not prepare that part of the that section in transparencies. But I wanted to give you a flavor of what we say. And I was very, very pleased, very happy to read this very simple paragraph by famous historian Satish Chandra, which comes towards the end of his book, History of Medieval India. He says, and there couldn't be a simpler and yet more comprehensive summary, the Bhakti and Sufi saints also brought about important changes in the approach to religion, laying greater emphasis on true faith than to the formal observances. They also contributed to the growth of regional languages and literature. But the excessive concern with religious and spiritual affairs resulted in a setback to the growth of rational sciences, especially to the cultivation of science and technology. So this is very perceptive, very insightful, and more on this in our next session. So I will end it here.